Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning from the Systemic Diversity and Inclusion Group. Today is Tuesday, the 7th of December. It's just gone 8 p.m. US Eastern Time, and we are back on Teaching Racism with Dr. Joseph Nwoye and Mr. Yigal Kahana. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, a very warm welcome. Yigal Kahana Esq is an attorney. He has operated an English language and human rights program for Israeli, Ethiopian, and Arab high school students for 10 years. And he now lectures, in fact, delivers remote Zoom lectures for the Israeli police force on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Dr. Joseph Nwoye has served at various levels, from undergraduate to teaching doctoral students, and in various administrative positions as both Director of Urban Education Programs and the Center for Multicultural Education at Illinois State. He's a professional development specialist and an adjunct faculty specialist. He recently accepted the position as president of the nonprofit organization Systemic Diversity and Inclusion Group. Today, Yigal and Dr. Nwoye continue their conversation based around the idea of on-teaching racism. So we'll start with Mr. Kahana, I think. He can take himself off of mute and join us here on the main stage, so to speak. And Mr. Kahana, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Adam. Good evening, Joseph. How are you today? Joseph, you have to take yourself off mute too.
Okay. All right. I'm doing well. How about you?
Thank God. You know, this is the 80th anniversary of the bombing of Pearl Harbor. How exciting is that?
Yeah. You know, that's so much. But I'm so glad, as they mentioned, the work you are doing among the Arab and Israelis. I think that's a very important work. So I must have to use this opportunity to say to you that I really appreciate the work you are doing over there. It's very important.
Thank you. Today I had the opportunity, the honor of having lunch with an Israeli Ethiopian woman that I met during the course of that work. She's here in the States for some education-related activities, and she lives in Columbus, Ohio now, and came down to Miami for a few days, and I got to see her, and our children know each other, and it was really nice to see her again. I haven't seen her probably in 10 years. Hopefully, I would like to have her as on the show someday soon. What do you think?
That sounds wonderful.
Yeah, I think that would be nice. In the meantime, she's got to go back to Cleveland, to Columbus, to her family. She's on the plane right now.
Oh.
So let's get into tonight's episode. And as always, we need to stress that our mission in conducting this series is to help progress society, and specifically in the area of working towards eliminating racism by unteaching racial thinking and racial ideas. It's part of the work needed to eliminate racist thinking and race-based behavior in our society is unteaching racial ideas. So one of the things that I thought was important, and we thought was important when we spoke beforehand, was that not just going directly at this, but also indirectly at some of the, we can call it the load-bearing walls that hold up the edifice of racist ideas in the curriculums that are taught, the curricula that are taught, and the worldview that is spread around through our educational systems. Unteaching racism is necessary because there are so many falsehoods being taught as truths in the world today, which contribute to a worldview in which the idea of racial division plays such a prominent part that it's almost impossible to go 5 minutes nowadays without hearing some example of racial thinking or racial division. Right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, this has been the reason why we're here. Because if you begin to ask those who teach this racial thinking, you find out that in some cases they cannot even articulate the origin of how it came to be. I was looking at Holmes and Kant and their historical work, and it goes to the heart of what you are saying. So historically, we've been morphing through all these things that consistently infuse falsity, and somehow it turns out as if it's the truth. So why don't you take us on the continental aspect to use it as an example to pinpoint some of the falsities we've grown to accept without question.
Gladly. So if we look at the map of the world, I was taught when I was in elementary school, I assume most people are, that there are 7 continents on planet Earth. And we all know what those continents are, right? Trying to scroll forward to. And what are those 7 continents? Can you see that map there, Joseph?
Yeah, I see it.
Right.
Absolutely.
And here we see 1, Australia. Australia is surrounded by water. What's the definition of a continent? In the dictionary, a continent is defined as a large body of a landmass surrounded by water. So that's the working definition that we have. That's the definition that we have to work with. It's a large body of land surrounded by water. So we can look at Australia and say, okay, Australia, that's supposedly a continent. It's surrounded by water. Makes sense. I can hear that. Then you have down at the bottom, Antarctica, which, because of the way the map looks, you can't see it clearly here, but we all know that Antarctica is also surrounded by water. So that would be 2. Antarctica, yep, surrounded by water. Actually, it is. 3, South America. Almost entirely surrounded by water, except for a little sliver of land there at Panama. We could say it's 99.9% surrounded by water. Good enough, we'll call that a continent also.
Absolutely.
North America, same thing. Surrounded by water, except for that little Isthmus of Panama. Counts as a continent. To me, fine. We can do that. That's 4. Then we have Africa, which it's still surrounded by water, except for a little tiny piece of land here at the Sinai Peninsula. Okay, we'll call that 5. Surrounded by water. But then we get to something that doesn't make any sense.
Absolutely.
If the definition of continent is a piece of land surrounded by water, you'd think that this giant chunk of land over there is all one continent surrounded by water. You can call it Eurasia. That would be 6. So why are we taught that there are 7 continents? How is it that there's no water between Europe and Asia, and yet somehow it's taught that there's 2 different continents? Really, that red line there, there's 1,200 miles of land between the Black Sea and, let's say, Estonia over here, or the Gulf of Bothnia the back end of Finland over there. So there's a jarring, glaring inconsistency here that these two things are called continents when really they're one continent. And Europe, if anything, is the way I see it, is a peninsula off of the end of Asia on the west side, just like Siberia and Kamchatka are peninsulas, is a peninsula on the eastern side of Asia. So the question should arise to any thinking person, why this inconsistency? Why in the world are people teaching that a continent is a landmass surrounded by water, but also teaching that Europe and Asia are separate continents when they're not separated by water? That would seem to be hopelessly inconsistent, no?
Well, I think this is really a watershed way to explain what has consistently go on. Can we imagine that this kind of thing that is so conspicuous that everyone will see it, and yet people tend to spread falsehood, unless if our working definition of continent is incorrect. But based on our working definition, it seems to me not to be clearly a lie. So the question becomes, why is it, as you indicated, that we have people teaching this all these years, and then also I'm not gonna let people who are learning it out of the hook, because they should be able to be asking critical questions. This is why I admire Socrates' method, which is searching for truth through questions, even when it's uncomfortable. So does it mean that we continue to do this? Because this is not only on this particular aspect. If you look at almost everything, someone will kind of come with a boogeyman will come up with a different ideas and say, hey, this is the way it is. That definition, we accept it. When I look at curriculum, and during my time of preparation for curriculum, there was something we say that curriculum was geared towards Western civilization, and some people will term it as great books. And we live with those falsities, and people don't ask critical questions to address those things, which I think, thank God, with diversity, we are now deepening into all aspects and bringing all these things to fore that we, hopefully will continue to do. And I'm not even gonna go into the issue that brought us here, that propelled us to focus on teaching racism. Because if you go to Holmes and Kant, these are people who kind of put people in places and give them, categorize people. And that morphed into all these things till Western and businesses, and they work together. At the time they began to make it to stick. That's why we talk about race, brown, white, this and that, as if we don't know how the evolution of color and how it brought us to whatever one may see. So those fallacies, I think we're gonna be really addressing them. It's high time.
I like the fact that you mentioned Kant and Hume, because a lot of people would call Kant and Hume among the classics of Western literature. I have a question. Again, if David Hume lived on the moon, would his book be any less good? If Kant had been born in Japan, would his book be any less good? His books.
Well, I think the answer is obvious. If the current situation, the current wind, we are blowing the way it was then, of course, there's no reason to say that it wasn't. I would say no. And that's adulteration of history, clearly falsehood, because if he had been written in that part of the world, it wouldn't be the case. Now, taking you back to, like, say, even religious group even got into the fray where they kind of look at color as they divided people and label people different names on basis of color. And then fast forward, we got into capitalism, those who benefit from the free job of slavery, sort of, propelled that to a new height that led to the type of things we are seeing today.
Right. Well, I think for this particular discussion, what's most relevant Europe and Asia are two separate continents when clearly they're just parts of the same continent, and whatever is not claimed to be Europe by default is Asia. Right? This is connected to the idea of Western civilization. Whatever is not claimed to be Western civilization by default is something else. But Western civilization, as much as I respect Kant and I respect Hume and Isaac Newton and John Locke, who are, yes, they wrote some of the classic writings and texts in history, wouldn't it be more appropriate to call what they did progressive as opposed to Western? I mean, again, they were east of America and east of Japan in one direction and west of Japan in another direction and north of Africa and south of Greenland. And what does the location have to do with anything? Isn't it the substance that makes greatness great instead of the geographic location? Where would exactly be the lines between the West and the so-called West and the so-called East? Does the West, you could ask, now include Japan and South Korea and the Philippines, which are west of the United States? And even more, when the Ottoman Empire held, let's say, Serbia or Hungary, did that make Serbia and Hungary Eastern? And then when Serbia and Hungary fell out of the Ottoman control, all of a sudden they became Western without ever moving? They went from east to west? That doesn't make sense. They haven't moved. They've always been the same place. It seems that the definition of east and west is completely subjective, and it's related to the subjectivity of the difference between of the line between Asia and Europe. And I think we should add, you see point number 14.
Right, I see that, but I would even want to say something about the question you posed. It's like Ottoman Empire. It means when they held Serbia, it will become either west or east, or it changes. So it goes back to the same question: is it what people do, or is it location, or is it location determined by the West? Or it's so confusing, but it's not supposed to be confusing, because a land that does not move. If he's in a location, he stays in that location. But you can see that, going back to the question you were asking, where does West begin and where does it end, and where does East begin, or is this just those who determine what is West at a convenient time will call it West, and at another inconvenient time they call it East? So these are the confusions and fallacies we are dealing with, and it's across the board.
Yes, I say, we have to conclude that these are completely subjective and arbitrary labels with no objective reality behind them. Because objective reality, you'd have to say, okay, is it like Australia that's certainly surrounded by water? Or is it something that's just completely fuzzy and can be defined at any time, however you want it to? Like the border between Asia and Europe, which doesn't really exist.
Well,
right.
Yeah, it's important that we remain consistent. Even as we speak today, we talk about democracy. Do we have different definitions of democracy? Where some people may say certain people may vote, some people may not vote. And this is again inconsistent with the truth. We have to begin to really hold people to fire that we're gonna be working with a common definition. You can't just be consistent or inconsistent depending on whether it's suitable at a particular point or unsuitable at a particular point, because that's how this morphing of race continues up to date. And that's why we're gonna do all we can to eradicate racial thinking. And those who hide under whatever corners on the earth and teach what doesn't exist based on truth, based on facts, we have to stop them. And we need more people to rise up and demand for the truth, because we want people to learn the correct and right thing, not to manipulate things based on convenience or inconvenience of situation.
And especially we're talking about education and teaching students, it's a lot safer and a lot more rational to teach students objective truths instead of arbitrary, subjective things that then when they grow up and have their own children, their children can learn something completely different. That makes no sense. We teach one generation 1 + 1 = 2, then teach the next generation 1 + 1 = 3. That's not a way to build a great civilization. It's not a way to maintain a great civilization. We can add, I think we should mention that the civilization that we have in the United States right now, and in what we call the free world, has nothing to do with location. It's been built upon a foundation of all the civilizations that ever existed before us, going back to ancient Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt. The first empire and the first written language were developed in Egypt. We still have a written language to this day, thanks to them. And that was in Africa. What we know as letters, in Egypt they wrote with pictures, but in hieroglyphics, what we know as letters and numerals came from Asia. In fact, even the name Europe comes from the princess Europa, who was a mythological Phoenician princess who's, according to the Greek mythology, came from Tyre in Lebanon, what's Lebanon today. That's in Asia. And even Christianity, they say America is a Christian religion, Western civilization is a Christian civilization. Where did Christianity begin? Oh, in Asia, right. So you have a Western civilization built on an Eastern foundation. What makes it Western? All over planet Earth, human civilization has been progressing since thousands of years ago. Couldn't we say that if there's any name that fits for our civilization, it would be progressive, right? Not Western. And when it comes to people voting, just to mention, if the rule is objective, that citizens can vote, non-citizens can vote, does it make a difference what supposed race the non-citizen is from? Either way, they don't get a vote. Does it make a difference which race supposedly a citizen is from? No, either way, they should be able to vote. That's an objective rule, not a subjective rule. Right? But from all this, we can only conclude that Europe is the inconsistent continent, non-existent continent, inhabited by people who identify themselves with a non-existent Western civilization and identify themselves with a non-existent white race. It all matches in its irrationality. So we have a holistic scheme of history, none of which makes any sense. And that's being taught, which is why we need to unteach all of this as part of unteaching racial ideas. But there can only be one real answer to the question, why have these lies been taught as if they are the truth?
Well, it's interesting that we are looking at it also, touching on the educational dimension of it. It's so important that we insist and galvanize force to ensure that people begin to adhere to objective truth. I did some work in Philadelphia, and within that time, my research demonstrated that we are in trouble. I say we're in trouble because in some cases, you see certain people teaching or pushing their particular ideology, which is not inconsistent with objective truth. And that's why I began to push for true diversity of opinion, which is real, diversity ideas that people may bring into the equation, which enriches all of us. So if we bring all those people and learn some of these garbage you see, whether it's the races that are operating with impunity, or because nobody would really caution them that they're wrong, or people who teach their own view of what history should be instead of what it is. It's really, really important that we begin by infusing the idea into schools and begin to figure how people could be held accountable for teaching falsity, whether it's in school or in whatever setting it is, because it's very important that we get to the truth. Again, I always like to go back to Socrates, where he used Socrates' method to teach, to inquire, and ask questions. If you're in doubt, you ask questions. By asking questions, you get to the truth. And that's what we're going to continue to hit on until we succeed in unteaching racist thinking.
Absolutely. And again, you're mentioning Socrates. Socrates is, from my point of view, neither Eastern nor Western. He's just part of the heritage of all humanity. And someone from any place can learn about Socrates and take him as an inspiration and follow his method of critical thinking to be able to narrow down to the truth themselves. It doesn't matter even if people move to Mars or the moon, they'll still be able to use critical thinking to solve problems and get to the truth. And at that point, the whole idea of West and East will become so much less relevant. And was there then going to be a war between the people on Earth and the people on the moon, like some Robert Heinlein novel? It's not necessary. I think the answer to the question before is that all those lies are taught, and I just modify what you're saying. That we don't. I don't even want to hold people accountable for teaching lies. I think we're at the point where now we've got to just get more people to teach the truth in the first place. And people who've taught lies, we can tell them that they're wrong. We can expose those lies, but to progress in the future, we've got to find a way where more people are teaching the truth in the first place to the students. And then we don't have to hold so many people accountable for teaching falsehoods. To bring this whole conversation back to unteaching racism is that whole idea of Western civilization and the whole idea of the distinctiveness of Europe is tied in with the idea of the distinctiveness of the white race. And if we don't believe that there are different races, we don't need this concept of a separate Europe or a separate Western civilization, unlike the people who came up with those ideas in the first place. You know, the Roman writer Cicero, you mentioned Socrates. We don't have anything that Socrates actually wrote. We have what Plato wrote, but we have what Cicero wrote.
Right.
That any person can, under the proper circumstances, be taught any given culture. The differences between people are not so great that certain types of people automatically have certain cultural qualities, and certain types of people will automatically have other types of cultural qualities, like from the cradle. It doesn't work like that. People have to be taught their culture and cultural elements, just like people have to be taught language or whether to dress in one way or another way based on the people around them and their environment. Right?
Yeah, I think those are important points that you are making. But I would be remiss if I don't bring out the idea that even religion was used as a defense for all kinds of atrocious things that had happened in the past. The institution of slavery, when you look at the economic part of it, and the reason why I think is very, very important when we pinpoint these things are that the people in political positions, philosophical people, intellectuals, economics, cultural individuals who we sort of respect and hold at a higher level, these were the same people who were propagating falsity. So if the people who are considered to be the lead people like Holmes and Kant did during those days, their work were, were very respected, and through their work, the people that read their work had to sort of dance to the tune of their work. So it becomes very important that we begin to really fashion our work to figure how do we get those who are the drivers of new ideas or implementing and so on to understand what we mean by unteaching racism. Because if we are doing this and some people are teaching that in other ways, especially those who have the megaphone, I think that they're gonna be doing more harm than we'll be trying to solve. So it's really, really important that we factor these things into the equation when we are focusing on teaching the truth, because I do believe that truth will bail us out. And we will have to push harder to ensure that we are factoring into the equation and compelling people to unteach racism or racist thinking, if you will.
Well said, Joseph. Well said. So I think that's our time is up for this episode. And I look forward to you coming up with a good outline for next week.
All right. Thank you so much, as usual. And I'm going to be working on getting something to you as soon as I can.
And
All
everybody
right.
out there, I hope that you enjoyed the presentation tonight. And we gave you something to think about, I hope. And we hope to see you next episode.
And feel free to give us feedback and continue to work on this.
We're always looking for partners.
Dr. Joseph Nwoye, Mr. Yigal Kahana on teaching racism on Tuesday evening, 7:30 p.m. US Eastern Time. Join us. And as we're so fond of doing from the award-winning documentary Playing for Change and Peace Through Music, the rendition of Bob Marley's song One Love, featuring Keb Mo and Manu Chao. Check out Playing for Change online and do stay in touch with us here at SDIG, the Systemic Diversity and Inclusion Group. If you have any questions or comments for Dr. Joseph Nwoye and Mr. Yigal Kahana, then drop them through to us by all means. info@systemicdiversity.org.
Let them all pass off the two remarks. There is one question I'd really love to ask. Is there a place for those complexity and out? But some has gone just to save us all.
It's been a pleasure having you with us. Thank you for joining us. This is SDIG, a presentation called On Teaching Racism.
Come on, let's get together.